Hello and welcome. My name is Minmal Quintana, and today we're going to be taking a look at deployment pipelines focused around, of course, Fabric. It was announced GA November of 2023, so a lot has changed with the product since then. So maybe now you've kind of looked in, maybe you checked in the most recent updates from the large Fabric conference that occurred, and you're thinking now's the time to dive right in, but you might be wanting to ensure that you've got something that you can kind of leverage built into the tool set so that you can kind of manage your organizational content, kind of have a life cycle process around that organizational content so you can kind of go develop your items, you can test those items, and then kind of prep that before it ends up getting in the hands of your users in a production workspace. And the built-in option just natively available to you within Fabric is going to be deployment pipelines. But we're going to take a look right here, a very introductory perspective to, hey, how can I leverage deployment pipelines? What's its purpose and intention? And a couple of really kind of immediate artifacts that you need to be aware of as you start into this process. Of course, once you start implementing this for your organization, it's going to evolve. You're going to become more elegant with this. You're going to start dipping into things like leveraging the Fabric API so you can do some automation. And some of these topics will be covered in future YouTube videos. So make sure you check it out, as I'm going to do a couple videos around this topic because there's actually quite a bit to get into. But this is all about kind of understanding its purpose, getting initially started, and like I mentioned, a couple of, I don't want to say gotchas, but a couple of immediate things that if you're not aware of, you could be caught off guard, and it is not immediately obvious. So that's going to be the goal. That's going to be the focus. We're going to dive right in to the Fabric space and look at deployment pipelines. So come on and join me. All right. So if we head on over, in this case, of course, I've already got a couple of workspaces set up and assigned. If we look at the screen here and I just go to my list of workspaces, I've kind of just pinned a couple here, just dev, test, and prod, just going kind of the classical 3-stage process. And in the development, you can see here, I've got this set up. Now, just in case, it should be noted, and I'll kind of mention this as we get into deployment pipelines, there's a good chance if you haven't been using deployment pipelines, you have a workspace already and you might consider it your production. You kind of haven't set up this element of a stage and then a test and then a prod, but you'd like to. Well, there's a couple of approaches here, right? You could follow what we're going to do in this video and say, hey, this is going to be dev, and then we'll just move it forward accordingly. But if you know it's your production, you're not going to make any adjustments or shifts. When we get to the process of assigning a workspace to a stage, technically, you could assign this to production, which means your dev and test would be blank, which is kind of out of synchronization. But there's a way to basically just take what you haven't brought and kind of move it back into, in this case, test, and then move that back into dev, making sure you're kind of starting from a point of synchronization, which is what we want here. And then moving forward, you can follow that standard practice of, all right, we make either changes or add new artifacts in the development workspace, which is where we kind of give those users access. And then we'll have this process, whether it be manual or automated, to move that information, move those changes or new artifacts to test, at which we'll have certain individuals a part of to do that testing before we eventually move into production, which is meant to not receive any direct or immediate changes, right? We're kind of controlling that process. That's what we mean when we go around kind of this idea of lifecycle management, right? So you can kind of go that way once we get the deployment pipeline here set up. I'll showcase that to you. But let's just dive right in, right? This is meant to be a quick view of it so you have an idea on how to get started. Like I said, I've set this up, dev, test, and prod. I do not have anything in the other workspaces. If we look over here, you can see that prod, nothing, and over here in test is nothing. So I'm going kind of that classical route and going to make my dev workspaces the first stage, the development stage of my overall process. So let's go ahead with no further ado. We go over in, more than likely yours is the same as me. Deployment pipelines isn't readily visible on the left-hand side, just kind of determinant on what your screen resolution is. But by hitting the ellipsis on the bottom, we can see it's right there. So I can go ahead and select deployment pipelines, which I have none just at the moment, but we're about to create it. And you can see it kind of gives you a brief description. You create the pipeline, you assign the workspaces to the various stages that you've dictated. Then of course you move through the actual process of deployment, that movement of information from stage to stage. And this has received a pretty major overhaul as far as the user interface is concerned within the last month or two. So it's kind of nice. Once again, depending on your viewing this will be well established potentially by then, but it is a good UI. I really do like it. And then we're going to kind of take a look. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit new pipeline right here. And we're going to see that I'm going to give this my demo pipeline. And of course, you can add any sort of description if you like. More than likely, as you kind of get this process set, you will have multiple pipelines handling the various different scenarios that you're leveraging. But it starts off, what do you want to call these stages? So I'm going to leave it as a default, but you can label this however you see fit, right? There's not really a lot to do here. Literally either Maybe I don't want a stage, right? You can go in here and say, I don't want a second stage. I'm just going to go straight from dev to prod. That's our scenario. Or you can hit a plus symbol and say, I'm going to add more. So this is the classic 3-stage. I could add another one. Maybe there's 4 stages, right? So you can choose exactly how you'd like this to be. So of course, I'm going to go ahead and call this test as it was before. Potentially you could add a description. Setting public basically just makes this pipeline visible to the end user. Basically, it's a setting for the workspace for generally if people want to have the ability of kind of requesting access. So you can, of course, go in here, brings you to the documentation on the idea. It's a little bit farther down too, like making it public. I think it's near the end here. Here it is. It's talking about making the stage public. So kind of an idea around it. A consumer of a public stage without access to the pipeline can see it as a regular workspace, right? They don't see the pipeline or anything like that. So kind of just a decision on how you want to make this available to your users. But for now, I'm going to leave that blank and just hit save. So I get back to the classic 3-stage test here. So with that being said, because that's really all you can do is name your stages, choose how many stages, you just hit create and continue, which then leaves us into the place of assigning workspaces, right? So not much you can do here either. Like I said, you just literally either can rename it or you assign it. That's it. So I'm going to go with my naming convention. So dev is going to be my development stage. Test is going to be my testing stage. And then of course, production. So we just check mark these and you can see our pipeline is effectively set now, right? If you go back to the deployment pipeline menu, this will be visible there. We can take a look at this really quick. Let me remove these workspace views and just go back as if I'm entering deployment pipes. And there it is. There's our demo pipeline. You can always rename this if you want to, but I can go in and I see the same view. And immediately you'll see that we get brought into this development view, which is literally my view of my workspace, right? This is every artifact that's in there. So initially, we're not going to see anything in the compared to source stage item. We're not going to see that here at this level, but immediately you'll notice that tests is yellow with a 7 indicating, hey, there is a difference between test and the immediately preceding stage of dev, right? So when we go there, we can see it's literally just a mirror image of what we just saw, except we have this identification of compared to source. Well, this semantic model only exists in dev. This report only exists in dev, which makes sense. We haven't moved anything yet from stage to stage, right? Production looks green because technically it matches exactly like test. They're blank, right? So once again, depending on how you set this up, potentially you could kind of move things backwards if you needed to. But in this case, we're going that classical route, that left to right, that dev, test, production, deployment. So I am going to start right here in tests. The idea is this is my initial thing, get everything synced up, and then I'll start moving forward. Now I know, hey, as we move things through, we need to create that process. As I mentioned in a future video, we can see how that could be automated through the form of the Fabric REST API. But for now, we're just going to go and deploy this, right? Very simple process here. You actually get to choose. Either you can select this button at the top, which selects everything, which let's say eventually once this gets staged, once we move this and sync dev and test, you can always click this. So even if it says it's the same, like there's no change, like it's matching, which we're going to see in a moment, you can still check it. It technically doesn't do anything because there's no changes, but you'll see statuses like only in source or you'll see only in target. So for some reason, I created an object specifically inside of this test workspace. It's going to say, hey, this doesn't exist over there, which once again, the idea here is to create kind of this workflow, right? Where we have lifecycle management, and that doesn't really fall in line with that. But there might be extenuating circumstances where you might just have an artifact just for test. Maybe you create an organizational app just in the test level so you can share certain Power BI objects with somebody, but it doesn't necessarily need to exist in development, possibly, right? There could be some reasons, and this will always visibly indicate that for you. So that will be a scenario too. If you don't want something to move from one stage to the other, you can of course deselect it, but we want to be kind of very intentional with this. I mean, to make sure we're following the purpose and intention around this. We don't want to constantly just be adding things right at the test or even at production level without there being any sort of redundancy before if we need to make changes or adjustments. The idea here is to kind of have that level of redundancy. So we're not just doing something on a production available item that doesn't work, right? That's something that's impacting our end users. It should be going to dev, then we test it out, and then we can go with confidence to production. That's the idea around it, right? So let's go ahead and simply hit deploy here. I am going to select everything so we get synced up. If you want, you can add a little annotation here around this deployment should you like to. You can see it says continue deployment in case one or more items fail. So let's say only 3 of these things can't sync. We will say, yes, I want that to happen. And then we'll deal with whatever error messages. And then once we get it adjusted, we can sync them over as well. So let's go ahead and deploy all of the things from dev over into test and kind of talk about what we see here. For the most part, right, there's kind of this object pairing. So we have a lake house, right? While this is going, I can go ahead and kind of highlight this so we can look at the artifacts that I've created. To be honest, if you want to follow along and try this out, you can do whatever you want, right? You don't need to have everything I have, but I've got a pipeline, I've got a lake house, I've got a data flow, I've got a notebook, I've got a report, a semantic model, and a warehouse. You can see the list here. So I want to add as many objects as I could. If we go into the pipeline itself, it's pointed to that lakehouse, which has its own unique ID. It's a GUID. It's an identifier. You can always check this out. If you're unfamiliar, you can always get IDs very easily from the URL. So if I clicked on this lakehouse, you can see it tells me the group is the workspace ID. So that's this number right here. Then here's my lakehouse ID, which is 6FB7, blah, blah, blah. So these are unique things. And we'll notice that when we go back to our pipeline, right? That was our ID for that lake house. When we go into test here, once it's completed this process, right, and it says successful deployment, sometimes there's a little like UI delay as far as this thinking bar. It'll eventually turn green here. There we go. And you can see same as source, right? This is how we kind of maintain this. But if I go to this lake house here, right, if I open this up, we can see it is the same group ID, right, as far as workspace is concerned. So if we bring this up kind of side by side here. So this first one here, we can see 712B. You can see it. Oh, actually, this one's kind of, different workspace. What am I thinking? Dev workspace, test workspace. So of course, different IDs. But the most important thing is if we look here, 6FB70154. And then 35D. So this kind of mirrored lakehouse is being reassigned to GUID, which is critical. This is what we want. But the important factor to consider here, and the reason why I'm bringing this to your attention is, well, if I have a pipeline which is loading data into a lakehouse, of course, I want initially that destination to be the lakehouse within the corresponding workspace. So my development pipeline, which is loading data into my lakehouse, needs to point to the development lakehouse. When I move this now to test, this pipeline here that says move data to lakehouse needs to be pointing to the actual lakehouse in test now. And of course, then continuing into production. If you go, you can look into this and you can validate this, but a very easy way is just to head into the workspace itself, right? We can just dive into that workspace for test. So let me go find test real quick. And I'd love to just look at lineage view. And this is going to reveal something pretty interesting, right? We can see, and you can open it up, check the URLs, check the IDs. We can see we have our Data Lake Gen 2. There's actually a shortcut that's been assigned, and we'll look at the lakehouse momentarily. We can see the lakehouse in question. Once again, if you go and you simply open this up, you can validate the IDs. I already showed it to you. And we can see our lakehouse is pointing to that. If there's an artifact here that would be from a different workspace, you will actually see it. And even though I haven't drawn my attention to it, you're probably seeing what I'm talking about right on our screen, right? Everything is kind of moving as far as its paired sources go, except for one thing. This is an important thing that you might not see is we have this semantic model here, right? This is something that you need to pay attention to, and we're going to look at here momentarily, but our test semantic model, which I probably should have labeled a little differently. It's our semantic model that existed in dev, and now we've moved it to test. Well, that semantic model is in our test workspace, pointing to the warehouse from our development workspace. So even though my pipeline kind of adjusted, my data flow adjusted, right? All these different things, we would have seen the lineage. It kind of handles that acknowledgement, kind of that transference, but this is not, right? This semantic model is actually pointing to dev, which we do not want. But there's a nice built-in capability to handle this that we can take a look at, and that's going to be called deployment rules, right? So we can see that's something we need to handle. And now if we go over, right, I'm going to kind of go back to the deployment view here, the deployment pipeline view. I'm going to go here, the ellipsis, pipelines. I'm going to go back into it, and I'm going to go visit the test element. And you can see there's this little kind of like lightning bolt symbol that we can go into. And what this does is it shows our artifacts and things potentially that we can leverage deployment rules. Now, at the moment, there's some limitations. There's not a ton of objects. So you can see if we go into the lakehouse, we don't see a ton. If you go in here and you start leveraging some of the newer preview items like variable libraries, you could have some options here. We do have, when we take a look at something like the warehouse, eventually, once again, if we start parameterizing elements, those will become available. But a big thing here is our semantic model. And this has been available for a little bit, but we can see it has two options, really just one for this moment. But if I had established any sort of parameters inside of the semantic model, those would become available under the parameter rule section. As of now, there are no parameters established. This could be something like controlling the value of a filter on a column, or it could be a server name. But in our case, you can see there's a built-in default data source rules. And if we take a look, when we go down here, it's kind of simplified at the moment. There's really just one rule is, This is what it's pointing to at the moment. So what is it currently from? And if we were to take the time and look at this, this is the SQL endpoint for the workspace, right? We can observe this ourselves. So before we make those adjustments, let's see what I'm talking about. I need to go to my development environment. Let's open up the warehouse. And here you're going to see the 225C1A, right? That ID that we just saw in the deployment rules of what is currently in my semantic model is this. It is the dev workspace. And we saw it in the lineage. This is just kind of showing you where that value is coming from. And the URL, the SQL endpoint, it can be found right here. And once again, this is it's basically a workspace SQL endpoint. And then that unique identifier actually represents the database within that SQL endpoint. Think of the workspace almost like a server, and the lakehouse or warehouse, whatever it is, those are effectively databases within that server. So this is what it's pointing at. So this is what it's asking of us. So actually, I'll leave this open just like this. Actually, what we want, because I can tell you right now, this all matches what we currently have, but what we want is for our semantic model to point to our warehouse in test. So I'm going to open up my warehouse in test. We can see it's just right here. This is going to be my new database, if you will, the ID for the warehouse. It goes right up to that question mark. And then we don't really need to worry about this is the same server name because it's workspace bound. But technically, if for some reason you want that semantic model to point to a different workspace, a different warehouse, you could, right? But we're going to kind of stick to this idea. I want my test semantic model to point to my test warehouse. And of course, the idea would be you'd eventually do the same thing we're about to accomplish, moving to production. So with this little window open, this is the way I like to go about it. I can go back over here, right, into test, look at my deployment rules for the semantic model, which we've already identified as pointing to development warehouse, and say, you know what, I'm going to set up a rule. So when we deploy, basically, what are we expecting? We're expecting it to say this because it's coming from development, right? And I want to change it to, notice it just literally has the same value, but I can change it to, and I can put exactly what I want. The server name remains the same as long as we want to keep it within the same, the server itself. So I'm going to go here to my demo warehouse. I'm going to copy this, right, just for redundancy purposes. And we're just going to paste that in right here, just like that. And the database, it's no longer this 225C1. We're going to go ahead and just grab it from the URL, just like that. Copied, pasted, just like that. And I'm going to hit save, right? So the idea here is, now it's a rule in place. So when the deployment occurs for this semantic model, we're expecting to see this result. And when you do, change it over to this. That's what we've set up here. But of course, we want to see this in action. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to go through, and I don't need to deploy everything, right? We can see I made no changes. It's technically not out of sync. You can say, look at this though. It's saying different from the source. So what I'm going to do is simply go here and I'm going to choose my test semantic model and I'm going to hit deploy. And the idea is now, once it's completed, I want to go to that lineage view. And when I look at the semantic model, it should be pointing to my warehouse from within the same workspace, which in this case is the test one. So give that a moment. It says it's successful. I'm going to go here. Like I said, sometimes it takes the UI just a moment to kind of validate, to turn green, and for this to say same as source. If you wanted to, a lot of times you can just like hit F5 and just do a hard refresh in the browser and it's good. There it is. And let me go to the lineage view now, right? We're going to go into that workspace, test. We're already in the lineage view, but I can see, look at our semantic model now. It is pointing to the warehouse that's now in the same workspace, as it should be, right? Dev to test, and then eventually we would have to create a similar rule for that production stage to account for that change in the actual, once again, endpoint and the database name, which is in this case, the warehouse name. So this is there. There can be other scenarios, as we mentioned, where you need to take account for these deployment rules. And this is something I do imagine that they're actually going to build out even more. So there's going to be kind of more default native things available to you. But you can do this there's some things with notebooks you can get into. Like I said, there's some Dataflow Gen 1 stuff if you're still there, but we're talking about Fabric, so probably not so much. And it depends, like I said, if you're dipping into the variable libraries, right? It's definitely something to keep an eye on. But like I said, just as an introductory level, if you're setting this up, this is very much something you need to be aware of, that semantic models don't kind of automatically adjust as you move between stages. So very nice UI. They've made some great changes. And this is right off the bat what you're going to need to do. Now, of course, as we talked about, it can get way more advanced. We can get into Fabric API to automate some of these things. And not only the whole deployment pipelines piece, but of course, there's the whole idea of getting into actual Git integration, right? Leveraging either DevOps or a Git server to have a true kind of full suite of CI/CD features, having a redundant storage of all this in a different service. That'll be a future YouTube that we'll discuss. There's some nice collaboration you can do between this. But it's more about understanding the architecture and how you're going to implement it. If you really want to kind of just dive in and get a better understanding of just Fabric, not necessarily this per se, but artifacts and lakehouses and, how did I load data in there, which is another concept that I haven't covered. I'll mention this real quick, but if you were to go and visit the actual test lakehouse itself and you go in there, you'll notice in here that I only am going to have one table. But if we were to go look at the development workspace, this table here, this lakehouse here has 3 tables and 1 shortcut. So the only thing we just saw was the shortcut available to us inside our test lakehouse. So that's another thing to understand. When we're moving from one stage to the next, we're actually just moving that artifact. We're not actually like moving data per se. So that's where you would want to possibly automate things like, okay, once it's moved, we're going to run that pipeline, which is going to now load our test lakehouse. Or, then from there, run the data flow, which then loads the test warehouse, right? So that's an important concept to also kind of go into. And when we get into that more advanced video around Fabric API and leveraging that for automation, that's where you can do stuff, right? Deploy, and then run that pipeline, run that data flow, and then the data exists there, right? So of course, we can then test the semantic model, which is derived from the data in that warehouse/lakehouse. Very important things, right? And there's a lot, but hopefully this feels adequate enough. You feel good enough to implement, or potentially if you've already been using it, use deployment pipelines with your Fabric artifacts. Definitely check out on our on-demand learning. There's a whole free Fabric Analyst in a Day class that you can take for yourself. And this will get you acquainted with these artifacts. You'll get to know about Lakehouse. You get to know about pipelines. You get to know about data flows. So definitely check that out. It's from my buddy Zane. It'll get you started. And then you can lay these deployment pipelines on top of that. So as always, I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you in the next one.